Yeah, there's been quite a lot of court cases that, well, the judgments have been released over the last 4 or 5 years. But a lot, well, they've all related to the legislation prior to the change in 2021. So it was the old rules where the contractor was liable rather than the client. So, um, yeah, whilst there's been a lot of judgments been released and a lot of talk about IR35, it's actually still relating to the old rules, which doesn't change a significant amount, but it is, yeah, that is what they relate to.
Okay. And are there any particular cases that come to mind that have sort of changed the landscape of IR35, do you think?
Yeah, so most of the recent cases have focused on the media sector. The one of the more recent interesting cases went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that very rarely happens that they get that far because you've got various appeal processes that they have to go through. And there was one case, although it wasn't IR35, it was normal employment status. It was about whether referees should have been employed or self-employed. Yeah, and because it went to the Supreme Court, that is binding on all other lower cases. So it's an important case to be aware of in that respect.
What was sort of a very quick summary of the case, and what was that about?
Yeah, so that was effectively the company's premier game match officials. They supply referees. They've got some that are employed, like a core group of employed ones that will do the Premier League games, and then they've got a group of national referees that will do the other leagues and the cups and things like that. And ultimately, yeah, it came down to they were all treated on a self-employed basis. Should they have been on PAYE was the ultimate question that was asked. They won their case at the first hearing when they went to the first tier tax tribunal. They got a partial win in the second. Then it went to the Court of Appeal and they lost. And then it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, they lost that. And HMRC won, proving that that they should have been on PAYE.
And what were the areas they fell down in then? Where did they lose the case?
Yeah, so the core areas really that were considered at the Supreme Court were the level of control over the referees and whether there was mutuality of obligation. They were the two areas that were discussed the most. So when you look at control, for example, the referees had to undergo a fitness test. They had to do an introductory seminar. They had disciplinary procedures, match day procedures to follow, assessment systems in place to assess how well they performed, and they were penalised if they didn't perform well. So when you look at that,
Yeah.
it does look like there's control. So that's ultimately what the court held in that respect. And then with mutuality of obligation, the argument effectively, so Premier Game Match officials would offer the role on a Monday. They would say, well, this is the place where we want you to officiate. The referee was free to accept or decline that as they wished. And they, at any point during the week, could turn around and say, well, I'm no longer able or willing to undertake that role until the Saturday morning when they arrived at the match. And then they would have a commitment to referee that match until they completed the match report on the Monday. So that was where that got argued effectively with Premier Game Match officials saying there was no mutuality because they could refuse work at any point, with the court effectively saying that didn't matter. And ultimately, in this case, like I say, at the point they turned up on that Saturday morning, they had to fulfill that work until they did that match report. So yeah, it was quite an interesting case, but and like I say, very, very few get as far in the tribunal and court system as that. So it was an important one in that respect.
And there's been quite a few in the media, hasn't there, recently? Do you see that set to remain, or I don't know whether
Um,
media?
no, so HMRC had a whole campaign in the media sector. So they were targeting TV presenters, commentators, pundits, cameramen, but anyone that worked in the TV and radio industry effectively. Um, Ultimately, wind back a few years before that, there was a lot of information in the press about how people were avoiding tax. In TV presenters were avoiding tax and so on by working through their limited companies, and it resulted in this whole campaign from HMRC that lasted about 7 years, where they were really hitting that industry hard. That seems to have come to a natural conclusion, and HMRC had great success within that. They did win a lot of challenges, or even if they lost, they won them then on appeal. So it was a good campaign from HMRC. Whereas prior to that, HMRC hadn't had a huge amount of joy with IR35. Their case law history in the tribunals was a bit hit and miss. Whereas this is really, they've had a good crack at this one.
Yeah, yeah, they certainly have. And is there any further campaigns lined up? Are you seeing any other sectors being targeted?
Um, the so they will always scatter some industries, but at the moment we are seeing that they seem to be targeting construction again. We've seen people literally HMRC caseworkers moving from that media campaign into construction. So there seems to be a real emphasis on construction. We're getting a lot more construction companies coming to us under inquiry. So I think that at the moment would appear to be, whether it's a specific campaign, I don't know, but it does certainly seem to be an area of interest. And construction always has been an area that HMRC have liked to dabble in.